Welcome to today's lecture. Today we are going to look at the phases in the development of comparative education. You see, we will be tracing the evolution from the traveler's tales to the social science perspectives. In a view to show you that comparative education did just happen. It has developed over time from the period where people just travel, come back with beautiful stories about other systems, and then wonder loudly, why are those systems functional? The very early ones, like the ones in Sparta and Athens in Greece, and people like Plato would compare the Spartan system and the Athenian system and give the Spartan systems a clean bill of health and say all education systems should resemble the Spartan system. Government controlled, government funded, and military in nature. So the objectives of today's lesson in the next slide, well, it is hoped that by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to explain the evolution of comparative education through its key phases. You'll be able to describe the major characteristics of each phase in the development of comparative education. It's also hoped that you'll be able to analyze the contributions of key figures in each phase, because each phase has key figures. And then finally, you should be able to assess the relevance of each phase to modern education theory and practice. So let us dive straight in. Well, we begin with the first phase, and that is the traveler's phase. Now, it's called the traveler's tales because it wasn't systematic. Yeah? It's one of the earliest phases, if anything, the beginning of comparative education, often referred to as the traveler's tales. This period stretches from prehistoric period up to around 18th century. The key features here is that people would travel and come back with stories about other systems, and these stories were more descriptive, even personal in nature, the way people viewed it. The danger was the story would be very fragmentary. People talking about things that are a bit uncoordinated, not piecing them together to come up with one coherent story. So you get tidbits of this and that over time. So these early explorers and missionaries, even merchants and conquerors, would write down what they saw in foreign schools and society. But their reports were not always accurate. In fact, many of them were exaggerated, sometimes colored by personal bias or the excitement of being, in a strange new place. It happens to most of us. It's also important to note that these writings were not motivated by academic research, but instead they were driven by curiosity, driven by commerce. People were traveling for commerce, or simply the need to conquer other territories. For instance, colonial administrators wanted to understand the people they were ruling. Missionaries, on the other hand, wanted to compare educational and cultural practices. And traders were simply, fascinated by what they encountered abroad. So what this phase gave us the first glimpses of the educational systems, it was more storytelling than science. There were no scientific methods used in doing this. But the most important part about this phase is that it laid the groundwork for the more structured and analytical approaches that would come much, much later. Now, important contributors to this phase were, Xenophon, Plato, and Marco Polo. Xenophon, who was a Greek philosopher, compared the education system of Persia and Sparta. Persia is modern day Iran. Sparta was a city-state in Greece. Yeah, so comparing Persian, and Sparta, then informed the way education was organized in Sparta and in Greece in general. Plato, on the other hand, compared Sparta and Athenian systems, and because he was interested in state-controlled, state-funded education, he recommended the education in Sparta as opposed to the one in Athens that was a little more liberal. If you remember your history of education, Spartan education system was military in nature, while Athenian education was a little bit more liberal, where besides the common goals of education, people were free to choose what they wanted to study. There was also Marco Polo, who was from Venice in Italy. Marco Polo travels to into the Oriental world, and really liked what he saw there. So being in those countries for more than 17 years, he comes back and wants to try to infuse what he saw in those countries to his own education system. Now we move to the phase of pioneers. This phase is also referred to as the phase of selective education borrowing, and we'll see why it's called that. Now, this phase of pioneers in comparative education ranges between around 1817 and 1900. And this period is sometimes described as the time of selective borrowing. Nations begin to look at what others were doing in education, pick out some useful ideas, and adapt them to their own context. Because, like I've said before, matters of education are contextual. But what was happening in the world at this time that shaped educational thought will surprise you, because this period lies at the intersection of important revolutions and important developments in the world. For example, the Industrial Revolution. Think of the massive changes in Europe, the rise of factories, rise of machines, mechanization, which led to the rise of urban centers. You suddenly wake up and societies need workers who could read, who could write, who could calculate figures, who could follow instructions accurately. So education begins to focus more on practical knowledge, focus on science, focus on technology, rather than just classical learning, where you learn the art of public speaking and you learn poetry. So schools are now forced to be seen as engines for producing a disciplined and skilled workforce to drive that industrial revolution. Next, we look at the French Revolution. The French Revolution wasn't just about overthrowing kings and queens. It was also about new ideas. It was about liberty. It was about equality. It was about fraternity. And these ideals pushed education towards being a right, a human right, a right for all. Not just a privilege for the wealthy or the clergy. It was a right for everyone. So universal access to schooling became part of what the states championed. And then there was the Agrarian Revolution. You see, by improving farming methods, it freed up a lot of labor. And what did that do? Families moved from farms to cities, and children were no longer only tied to agricultural work. So what this did was to create a need for mass education system. We can trace massification of education to this area to prepare young people for industrial and urban life. And then finally came colonization. If you remember the Berlin Conference, if memory serves, around 1884. where European powers spread their systems of education to colonies in Africa and Asia. But this was selective and often meant to, serve the colonizers' interest. You see, producing clerks, interpreters, and sometimes low cadre administrators who could help run colonial governments. At the time, colonization brought about cross-cultural borrowing in education, where you borrow one element from this system, another element from another system to make a whole. So when you put all these together, the period between 1817 and 1900 became a turning point. Education was no longer just about passing down tradition. It became a tool for nation building, for economic development, and even ideological struggles. And this is why we call it the phase of pioneers. Why? Because it laid the foundation for modern education system through selective borrowing. And we're saying selective borrowing because you only borrow what you think would be useful to your system. The next phase, before we go to the next phase, maybe we should talk about the contributors, the key figures of that phase. And you can't talk about that phase of pioneers without talking about Victor Kazi, who is the one who advocated for the borrowing of education practices from Prussia. Prussia is a region around neighboring Germany, within the German territory, to reform the French education. And then there's Horace Mann. Horace Mann borrows a lot from European education systems and tries to improve the American system, or draws lessons that American systems could then adopt. Now we go to the next phase, which is the phase of cultural context, otherwise also known as the phase of philosophers. See, after the period of travelers' tales and descriptive reports, comparative education entered a more thoughtful stage, and this stage is called the phase of cultural context, or the phase of philosophers. In this phase, you see the focus shifting from, simply describing what was happening in schools, in other countries, to a lot more important questions, deeper questions about, why our education system the way they are in those places. What cultural or social cultural, what philosophical factors shape them? Thinkers and philosophers started analyzing education in relation to society, not in isolation. For example, they considered how religion, how traditions, how values, and community structures influence what children learned and how schools were organized. This becomes a turning point because it marks a move away from mere observation towards systematic reflection. Instead of just saying, this is how schools in country X look, scholars now try to interpret and explain those differences. In short, this phase helps comparative education grow into an intellectual discipline that recognized education as a product of culture, as a product of philosophy, and not just a set of classroom practices. Key figures in this phase are Michael Sadler. Remember, we've quoted Michael Sadler before, and he's the one who says things outside school affect things inside school. Michael Sadler emphasized the nexus between education and society. And he talks about education as being very contextual. When you think about issues of education, you put them in a context. You say this is happening in country A because of these forces: economics, politics, geography, and so on and so forth. And then there was Isaac Kandel, who argued that understanding national character and historical context was very important in education systems. What do you mean by national character? There is what we call the national character of education. How do you run your schooling system? This is also very contextual. Different countries have different ways of running the education system. Take, for instance, socialist countries. They run their system with the aim of trying to produce a more equal society, as opposed to capitalist countries where schools are run, and even if it's unconsciously, they perpetuate inequality, because the rich go to good and well-funded schools, the poor go to poor and underfunded, understaffed schools. We move to the social science perspective phase. That is 1945, after World War II to present day. Now, after the Second World War, the world changes dramatically. Nations are now rebuilding. New countries are now emerging. And many of the countries a little later begin to gain their independence from their colonizers. Education was seen as a key driver for development and democracy, and even peace. But here's an interesting shift. Scholars stopped looking at education as an isolated system, but instead they began to ask, how is education connected to society? How is education connected to the economy? How is education connected to the politics? So what this does is it gives rise to what we call interdisciplinary approaches. Education started to be studied alongside sociology, alongside economics, alongside political science and other fields. For example, sociologists will look at how schools reproduce social inequalities. Why children from wealthier families often succeed more than those from poor families. What about economists? Economists started talking about education as investment, that when you invest in education, it's just like any other investment. And they're the ones who coined the idea of human capital, that the human beings become capital. So the more we invest in people's education, the stronger the economy grows. But political scientists started exploring how education supported nation building, how education supported democracy, how education supported good governance. So education was no longer studied in a vacuum. It became part of the wider social science. This first gave us some tools, some theories to deeply analyze educational systems. Why they work, the way they do, and how they can be reformed. Do we need to reform? And that's different. You know, why do we call it the social science perspective phase? Because it integrates knowledge from different disciplines to understand the big picture, to understand education in a more wholesome way. Now, a few important figures can be discussed alongside that phase, but one of them is Vernon Mallinson. Remember, he gave us one of the definitions of what comparative education should be. And he focused on how national character affects education, the national character. And then we have Joseph, who advocated for collecting data that was reliable. This data would then be used to facilitate comparative studies. Let's quickly delve into the impact of industrial and social revolutions on comparative education. The Industrial Revolution completely transformed societies. You know, factories were springing up, towns and cities were growing, millions of people were moving from rural to urban centers. Now, these shifts, we see it creating new educational challenges. And schools were now expected to produce literate, disciplined, skilled workers who could fit into the needs of industrial economies. So education started to reflect the demands of the modern industrial societies. Modern in the sense that then we started having regular timetables, we started having standardized testing, We started having vocational training colleges to equip people with practical skills that could be used to run the industries. At the same time, colonization spread Western education system to different parts of the world. And in Kenya, we were big with mission schools. Mission schools and colonial governments introduced European-style education in Africa, even in Asia and Latin America. But here's the interesting point. As Western education spread, it created the need for scholars to start comparing systems. They wanted to understand how education looked in different contexts, why it worked in some places, and why it did not work in other places, and what could be learned from those differences. What accounted for those differences? What accounted for those similarities? So the global changes brought by industrialization, brought by urbanization, brought by colonization, laid the foundation for the rise of comparative education as a discipline. It was no longer enough to just study one country system. You had to compare across regions to make sense of education in this changing world. A bit about technological advancement and how it relates to comparative education. This is another key turning point in comparative education. What is the role of technology? Advancement in data collection and statistical analysis methods has completely changed how researchers approach education systems. In the past, comparisons were mostly descriptive. Scholars would just narrate what was happening. This is happening in this country as opposed to that country. We wish this could happen here. But with stronger data tools, we can now measure things like literacy rates. What are the literacy rates? What are the enrollment levels? What are the dropout rates? What is the teacher-pupil ratio in countries? What is the recommended? What is the global best practice? That can be measured using IT tools. And you guessed it. This makes cross-national comparison more reliable. It makes them evidence-based, that it can be supported. Their assertions can be supported by statistical data. Then came computers and information technology, which further expanded the field. Suddenly, vast amounts of educational data could be stored, could be processed, could be shared, and not just within countries, but on a global scale. Some international organizations like UNESCO, like the OECD, that is Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, headquartered in Paris. These ones could now run large-scale comparative studies. For instance, there is this PISA test, which is a European test trying to see how schools are performing in terms of literacy. So technological advancement didn't just make comparative education easier. It made it more scientific. It made it more global. It made it more policy relevant. And today, when we start comparative education, we are drawing on databases, digital archives, and international networks that were, up till now unimaginable. A little bit about global education movements after World War II. What happened after the Second World War? It's a period that, after World War II, it was one of those most significant periods in the history of humankind, because it completely reshaped education worldwide. You see, out of the devastation of that war, we had the formation of UNESCO in 1945. The idea was simple and powerful. If nations could work together, in areas like education, if nations could work together in areas like science, like culture, perhaps future conflict could be avoided. So UNESCO took the lead in promoting global educational reforms, encouraging countries to share knowledge, to share practices, to share policies. And for the first time, education was seen as a global responsibility, not just a local or national issue, much as we were going to be local, act local, but think global. So UNESCO coordinated studies and these studies produced reports that supported education expansions in these newly created countries and newly independent countries. Perhaps it's important to say that it was during this period that comparative education really gained ground as a field. Scholars and policymakers began to look across borders, comparing systems, and using those insights to design reforms, especially in developing nations in Africa and Latin America. So the post-war era marked the rise of the global education movement, with UNESCO at the center of it, and comparative education became a key tool for international development and cooperation. Now, each of the phases we've described has developed over time and has contributed to the development of comparative education with more refined data. We've shifted from describing phenomena in other countries, describing education systems from other countries, to doing scientific methods of research. Now, importantly, you also want to start connecting these phases to what's happening today. Are they relevant today? Do we still have travelers coming back with very beautiful stories about systems in other places? They are still relevant. We do have a lot to learn from people who have traveled to other countries, studied in other countries, and you know they come back with what they consider as best practices. Lessons from those other phases, such as selective borrowing, traveler's tale, still apply today and still inform policy reforms in other countries. Well, we've come to the end of the lesson, and thank you very much for your attention. You'll find more comprehensive notes on the learning management system. Until next time, goodbye.